بەیانیتان باش بەخێر هاتن سەر چاوان بەخێر بن بۆ ئەم باس و خواسە لەگەڵ پرۆفیسۆر فرانسیس فوکەیاما کە بێگومان لای زوربەتان ناسراوە وەکو بیرمەندێکی گەورەی ئەمریکا و جیهان نووسەرێکی دیار پسپۆر لە بواری زانستی سیاسی و ئابووری و ئێستاش پرۆفیسۆر و بەڕێوەبەری ناوەندی دیموکراسی و گەشەپێدان و یاسا سەروەری لە زانکۆی ستانفۆرد. قسە دەکەین لێ دەگەڕێم ئەو باسی کۆمەڵک لەو بابەتانە بکا کە لای خەڵکی ئەم ناوچەیەش مەبەستە لەگەڵ باسکردنی بیر و بۆچوونەکانی لەسەر پرسەکانی ئەمڕۆی جیهان. بەڵام باسەکەمان بە ئینگلیزی دەکەین بۆیە ئەوانەی کە پێویستیان بە تەرجمەکردن هەیە تکایە ئینەکە بخەنە گوێتان. It's a pleasure, Professor. It's an honor to have you with us. And obviously, yesterday was quite an eventful day. We had many dignitaries, His Excellency the Prime Minister of Iraq and many distinguished guests that have come. But you being with us today means a lot to the university community, to the city, and indeed to the people across this country. People know you as an icon of thought, intellectual grasp of issues of the day. Many people identify you with your famous book, which started as an essay, The End of History. I remember I was in Washington at the time when the book came out. Going back to my old leftist days, I remembered Marxist ideology telling me the end of history was about communist utopia. You were making the point that end of history was coming, or at least the way I understood it, end of history was coming because that was the triumph of liberal democracy. Almost 30 years on from that book, from that essay, have we witnessed the triumph of liberal democracy? Is that the end form of human government? Or are we seeing democracy in crisis and is being challenged? So.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Barham. Before I answer your question, I'd like to say this is my first visit to Kurdistan. I'm really delighted to be here. I have really understood that over the years this has been an oasis of stability in a very troubled region. I've also heard great things about this wonderful university, and so I'd like to congratulate you and the leadership in this region for having created these kinds of institutions. So, first of all, you did me the favor of explaining my own thesis in a way that it's the same way that I explain it. So the end of history was not that events stop happening. It's really the question of modernization, that societies develop from primitive ones to agrarian societies to industrial societies, and the question is, what lies at the end of that development process? And as you said, the Marxists for 150 years maintained that the end would be communism, there'd be a higher form of civilization. And I think that it's pretty clear that that's not true. And the real question is there a higher form of political order than a liberal democracy with a market-oriented economy? And despite all of the alternatives that are out there, I think it's pretty clear that there's not one that really looks very plausible for most people to aspire to. The only regime I think that has a chance of being a competitor now is China, because it's an authoritarian but largely capitalist, pretty successful society. But we'll have to see whether that remains a stable model. The problem, I think, lies in the question of whether everybody is going to get there. And that's where things are really different now than they were 25 years ago. In the 1990s, things looked very promising because we were in the middle of what's called the third wave of democratization. We went from about 35 democracies worldwide to, I think, currently about 110 or 115 today. So there's a huge expansion, but the quality is the problem. Issues of corruption, of poor governance, and then actual regression from democracy back to something that resembles more some form of authoritarian government, which you can see in a number of places, in Russia, in Hungary and Turkey. We'll talk about the United States in a moment. So.
Sure. In terms of the democratization of what was the developing world, or what is the developing world, Afghanistan, Iraq, you were one of the advocates of the war in 2003. I think since you have revisited some of the assertions associated with those positions at the time. Reflecting on, and this is your first visit not only to Kurdistan but indeed to Iraq as a whole, reflecting on that American engagement, that push for democratization, where we are on that, how do you see it?
So I must say that the experience of the United States in both Iraq and Afghanistan is really what shaped my current view of politics and political institutions. So I was in favor of an intervention before the war happened. I thought that Saddam Hussein, was a terrible tyrant and that the world would be better off without him. But beginning in the months just prior to the war, the real question that stuck in my mind was the state-building question, that if the United States military toppled Saddam's regime, we would then become responsible for Iraq. And I, based on the earlier experience of American foreign policy in Vietnam and Central America and many other places, it seemed to me that we were not prepared to make the big investment that would be needed to really create a new democratic Iraq, or even an Iraqi state, a coherent Iraqi state, let alone a democracy. And it turned out that that was not just a correct worry, but the lack of preparation for that state building phase was even, the deficit was even greater than I thought. And I think that to this day remains the big problem of American foreign policy in this region, that you can't get to stability, you can't control terrorism unless you have coherent, legitimate states. But as an outside power, we still have very limited capacities to do that.
But in this day and age of this globalized village, where the security of Sulaimani, New York, Paris, the rest of the world are so intertwined, you as a global power, you the United States, the West, has a stake in the security and stability of these countries. That leads me to your latest writings on political order, about the origins of political order and political decay for that matter. I mean, this is becoming like a black hole, sucking in so many resources, creating these dynamics, these hurricanes. And from my perspective here, and I'm sure from the perspective of many people in this region, we do not see a way out. And in terms of political thought, how do you see the prospects of this?
Well, first of all, in my framework, I would divide a modern political order into three parts. So the first part is the state itself, which is a monopoly of force. It's really about the ability to use power, not just to repress or not just for security purposes, but also to deliver services, to provide a fair and impersonal deployment of resources to the population. All right, that's one. The second is a rule of law that limits the state. That means that a ruler cannot simply do whatever he wants. And then the third is some form of democratic accountability, in which the people as a whole get to choose their leaders and to hold them accountable. I think that actually what both in this country and in Afghanistan has been demonstrated is actually the democratic part of that is the easiest part to get to. It's relatively easy to hold elections, to have a more or less legitimately elected government. The hard parts are really the state building part. I mean, actually getting an impersonal state going, and then the rule of law that limits it. With regard to the first, I think the problem of corruption in a certain way has replaced the issue of democracy as the central divide in the world today. So if you say, what's the issue that I as an American have with Putin's Russia, it's not that it's not democratic. If he held an election tomorrow, he would be reelected, I'm sure, with a very large majority. The problem is that the Russian state is not a modern impersonal state. It's based on cronyism that reaches all the way to the center of the regime, in which the political leaders are in politics not to be able to serve a broad public interest. They're in the business in order to extract resources for themselves and their families. That's fundamentally the divide. And I think that that problem of dealing with a state based on rent seeking, on the distribution of rents, has become the central governance issue that has really stood in the way of this region. And this region has a particular problem because of resources. The problem of a rent extracting elite is much more severe if resources are just coming up out of the ground. Because they're easy to hide, they're easy to manipulate, and it means that governments don't have to tax their own people. Taxation in Europe was the classic route to political accountability and to democracy, but that's been largely something that governments in this region have been able to avoid. And so that, I think, is really one of the reasons why, that's what I would identify as the central lack. It's the lack of basic stateness and the legitimacy that's needed to maintain a modern state.
Professor, I consider myself a liberal Democrat, and I do believe in liberal democracy. But having worked in politics in this part of the world, the notion that liberal democracy could be just the Western model begs the question of culture, history. I agree with you. Resources, oil, easy money, no taxation, no accountability, no representation are all flowing with each other. But this part of the world has also a major, major issue with culture, role of religion, Reformation. These are also factors because some of these problems in the Middle East predate the oil curse, in my view. At least the way I say it. What does that fit into this notion of political order? And especially in this day and age of globalization.
Right. So this is a big debate I had with my former teacher and mentor, Samuel Huntington, who believed that these cultural differences were fundamental and would be persistent and that nothing would ever change. And I, think that it's undeniable that factors like religion make a big difference. You'd be stupid not to realize that. But cultures also change. So if you look at the history of Europe, how is it that we got to liberal societies that were based on tolerance, the idea that religion should be a private matter but not something that people fight over? It's not inherent in Christianity. For many, many centuries, every Christian prince was also, the head of the church, was responsible for propagating Christianity. But then after the Reformation, in the 16th century, Europe fought 150 years of extremely bloody wars. Half of the population of Germany was killed in this period during the 30 Years' War. And at the end, there was a recognition, I think, that if sectarian religion were the basis of governance, in a religiously mixed society, this was a formula for endless conflict. And I sort of think that a lot of the Middle East is in a similar kind of situation right now, that you have conflicts not just between the world of Islam and the West or other civilizations, but within Islam. Sectarianism has been driving, a massive, in effect, a civil war throughout this region. And I think that ultimately, as in Europe in the early modern period, the only solution to this is some form of liberalism. That is to say, a political system that deliberately tries to take religion out of politics. That does not deny people a religious identity, but they cannot base their political rule on a claim to religious legitimacy, and they cannot impose one particular form of religion on other people. I honestly don't see how you're going to get peace in this region unless that basic formula is accepted, and that's not a culturally specific, that's not a Western idea. I mean, as I said, in the West itself, that's something that had to evolve over time.
On the issue of democracy, again, we celebrated democracy in Iraq, and for that matter in Kurdistan. The democracy is the most difficult part. Elections are the easiest part. You can conduct elections, people can go to poll, whether the elections are free and fair, and whether you honor the outcome of elections, and whether elections lead to accountable and responsive governments. Again, from my experience, I'm reading some of your latest writings on these issues. I can echo or understand the significance of the notion of good governance as a more important or consequential term than the notion of democracy, meaning elections, because elections have been with the purple finger and everybody is so happy with it, we have voted. The consequences, and this is what I see in many segments of our societies, that these elections do not matter, make our lives worse. Others are coming in that are not necessarily making our lives better. So this issue, I want to get into this issue of good governance, development, as part of this notion of political order that you've been writing about recently.
Well, you're absolutely right that I think in terms of things that matter to people's lives, democracy is not the first issue. In fact, democracy can be the enemy of good governance when it leads to the election of politicians who basically are running patronage networks that simply want to stay in power by giving people, basically bribing their supporters with government benefits. That's not good governance. I think that, and I think the measure of a government that's able to govern well is actually one that can provide electricity, right? That can provide 24/7 reliable electricity. And this is not necessarily something that democracy itself brings about. This is a state capacity that exists in non-democratic regimes. So Singapore, China, were able to electrify their societies at a very early stage without having elections. So I think you need a balance. I think you need both, because the problem is if you only have good governance, so-called, without ultimately the sanction of elections, then rulers over time, even if they're good today, they don't necessarily stay good because there's no fear of accountability that keeps them honest. So I think that democracy does become an important component of governance. But the governance itself is a matter of state capacity and good leadership. It means having a government that actually has the technocrats and also has the mandate that does not necessarily come from elections, but a certain kind of legitimacy to be able to actually make decisions and then to enforce them.
But this is a universal notion. I mean, people seeking protection, rule of law. I consider rule of law part of good governance. Equality before the law, and the leaders to be accountable. But at the end of the day, it's about basic services, education, healthcare, and that applies to California, to Basra, to Sulaimani, to anywhere else in the world. So here, again, I want to go back to your former teacher, Huntington. Clash of civilization. This is, again, with the end of history, these are probably the two major themes that was associated with the end of the Cold War, that in the eyes of intellectuals and people who follow political thought. What are we on the clash of civilization, especially in this day and age of ISIS, the notion of radical Islamic terrorism, the debate in the United States, the debate in Europe for that matter, and certainly the debate in the Muslim world about our relationship with the West? Is there no defining characteristics in that? Is there no some legitimization to some of the theories that, or thought that Huntington has offered at the time?
Well, unfortunately, I think that we are at a very dangerous point in the history of world development because I think since September 11th, most Western governments have been able to control the way that the narrative about Islam in the West was articulated. George Bush was very clear to say that we're not fighting Islam, the religion, we're only fighting extremists within a broader community where many people, have democratic ideals and so forth. And now in the West, you've seen a number of new governments, new populist, nationalist movements arise who don't care about that, who would like to exploit fear of cultural difference for their own political purposes. And unfortunately, I'm afraid that we've got one of these people in power in the United States right now who can use this fear of a generic fear of Islam as a way of appealing to popular passions in a way that I think will be very dangerous because it's going to set off a corresponding set of reactions in the Muslim world, in other Western societies where you have very similar kinds of movements being, gaining power.
I don't know whether you are advising the new administration or not. But I'm sure what you write, people read. What would be your advice first to the Western world, in a sense, about how to tackle, how to address this relationship between the Muslim world, between Islam and Western civilization, and for that matter, from your own long experience with this part of the world? What are the challenges that we people of this region need to look at, and how can we also communicate our message in a better way?
Well, I think we need to go back to the posture that both the Bush and the Obama administrations basically adopted, which is, this is a very complex region in which there are many different forces acting. Some of them are very extremist and very, very dangerous. They have to be met with military force. There's very little way to have a real dialogue with them. But there are other people that have very different kinds of opinions, and it's a basic rule when you're fighting counterterrorism that the terrorists are a very small part of the total population. You are completely dependent on the goodwill of all of the populations that surround the terrorists for intelligence, for support. If you don't have them on your side, you're not going to win that war. You cannot win it by bombing or by brute, hard military power. And I think every country that's ever waged a counter-terrorist war has come to that conclusion. So I think that very painfully the United States got to that point in both Afghanistan and Iraq, and I think we are in danger of losing it because we're going back to this broad brush kind of cultural stereotyping of people, which, by the way, is also, it's just stupid from an American standpoint. I mean, I personally have, any number of friends and colleagues who got caught in this stupid travel ban that the new administration launched, the first week it was in office, which I think is going to cut off American access to knowledge about the region, simple ability to communicate, to find out what's happening. So that's why I think we're in a very dangerous period. And so I regard the role of people like me. Donald Trump isn't going to listen to me, but I think that collectively, we Americans have to really kind of continue this debate and say that there's an alternative way of treating the region and of treating our own citizens. And by the way, I mean, my own family had experience of this because I'm a Japanese American. My grandfather came to the United States in 1905. He built a business in Los Angeles, a hardware store, and then at the beginning of after Pearl Harbor in 1941, there was an order that all Japanese on the West Coast would be put into internment camps. And so my grandparents, my aunts and uncles all went into these relocation centers for the entire duration of the war. And I think that one of the things that we felt that we had achieved by the time of the Reagan administration was a recognition in the United States that this was a grave injustice. Treating your own citizens simply on the basis of ethnicity was something that was never going to happen. And unfortunately, you know, I think this kind of broad brush treatment of an entire group is something that politically sells among a certain part of the population. And so opportunistic politicians are going to make appeals to this sort of thing.
For our part of the world, as you observe us, as you observe the political developments, cultural developments, the debate within Muslim societies, Arab societies, Kurdish societies, if you were to compare our stage in history with other parts of the world, where we are at, how do you see us evolving? How do you see us this part developing?
Well,
in terms of political culture, in terms of identity politics, in terms of our relationship with the rest of the world for that matter, not just the West.
So, for a long time I have, in fact, this is going to be the subject of a book that I'm writing this year about identity and identity politics. So I think that this part of the world is where Europe was in the late 19th century in many respects. In the late 19th century in Europe, you were transforming a peasant society, an agrarian peasant society, into a modern, urban, industrial one. People were streaming in from villages into big cities. They were working in impersonal factories, living in apartments where they didn't know their neighbors. That whole experience is extremely disorienting in terms of identity, because it used to be your identity was set by your local priest, by your family, by your little village that you came from, and all of a sudden you're in this much more complex world where there's much more diversity and so forth. Now, the classic argument about European nationalism was that was the origin, basically, of Hitler, that all of these confused former peasants got this message: no, you're a German, you're part of a great German community, you just don't know it yet. And that's what links you to other Germans in your situation. And I think that the argument has been very plausibly made that religion plays a similar kind of role, because many people have urbanized in the Middle East. There's not been the same level of industrialization, but in a way, with modern communications technology, you don't need to industrialize. The world comes to visit you. And if you're a Muslim and you move to France or to the Netherlands, you're also in a very different kind of world where the points of reference, cultural points of reference in your village no longer exist. And so I think psychologically, you have the same lack of identity that in which Islamism can fill the gap. Osama bin Laden or Baghdadi or any of these leaders can say, no, I'll tell you who you are. You're a Muslim of a large ummah that stretches all the way from, Tangier to Indonesia, that's your identity. You just don't know that that's the case. And that's, I think, what this region is going through at the moment. So I think it's very comparable to the rise of nationalism in Europe in the previous century.
Different form of nationalism in a sense, identity politics. Yeah. That actually ties into what you have also spoke about, populism as a new way of doing politics with huge consequences, not just in the West, but in our part of the world too as well. This has become quite a pronounced phenomenon. Populist political movements that cannot, at the end of the day, deliver, get societies tied up with, and politics somehow getting dysfunctional.
Well, So we've been going through this period of unprecedented global integration since 1945, led largely by the United States, both economically and politically. So we have a World Trade Organization, we have the unprecedented movement of goods, services, people across international borders. It's been very successful. Global economic output quadrupled between 1970 and the crisis, the US crisis in 2008. The problem is that it had a very uneven effect on people in the developed world. And so the working class that used to think of itself as middle class, as being very successfully part of the society, a lot of these people were left behind. A lot of them saw their incomes fall. A lot of them saw their social status falling relative to more recent immigrants, to other people that seemed to be doing a lot better than them. These are the people that voted for Brexit in Britain. These are the people who voted for Donald Trump in the United States. If we want to go further afield, I think that if you look at who supports Vladimir Putin, who supports Erdogan in Turkey, who supports Viktor Orban in Hungary, it's not the most educated, youngest, most cosmopolitan, urbanized population. So none of these people are popular in their own capital cities. If you go to Ankara or Istanbul, you know, Erdogan, I mean, that's really the hotbed of opposition to Erdogan. All of these people get their support from less educated, more rural, less cosmopolitan people. And, you know, these are the ones that haven't benefited from globalization to nearly the extent that the elites in the cities have done. And now we're seeing this in the United States as well.
Liberal Democrats across the world were looking to the United States as a beacon of liberal values, liberal government. American democracy is a model. Is American democracy challenged today?
Well, I hate to talk about my own country in this fashion, but I'm afraid that, I have really not experienced a moment in my life where I thought that fundamental democratic institutions in the United States were under the kind of sustained attack that they have been this past year. Now, I must say, my prediction is that the institutions, the checks and balances in the United States ultimately are going to be strong, and that American democracy will pull through, this moment. But you have a president who basically has challenged the basic legitimacy and credibility of many basic American institutions. So the Federal Reserve Board, the intelligence community, the mainstream media. Anytime one of these organizations has done something that he doesn't like, he goes on Twitter and attacks it. And I think that democracies basically need trust. They're competitive. There's a lot of political contestation, but fundamentally, people have to see that their government does represent them in a fair way. And if you have, as a result of partisanship, this constant undermining of trust in basic institutions, you're not going to have a democracy at the end. So I think, again, in the United States, domestically, we are at a pretty important juncture. I do think the institutions will hold up, but it's going to be a struggle.
Professor, I want to ask one final question, a subject very dear to my heart. I am a believer in the power of technology. You have been also talking a lot about the post-human history, the impact of technology on human societies, on the development, and where are we on that? What are your views? Share with our audience.
Well, that's really interesting. Living in the middle of Silicon Valley, as I do, there's this constant optimism, which started with the rise of the internet in the 1990s, that the internet would be very good for democracy because information is power, and the internet would give people direct access to information. And in many respects, I think that's been true, that if you look at the big revolutions, democratic revolutions that have taken place, the internet and social media in particular were very, very important. The trouble is that once you remove all of the guardians of information, you eliminate not just authoritarian states, you also eliminate newspapers and magazines and editors and fact checkers and a lot of people that created trust in the kind of basic factual information that we have access to. And this is really the problem that we faced in American politics, is people not being able to agree on fundamental facts like who won the election. And this has also become a tool. I would say that Putin in Russia has been the one who figured this out the earliest, that you can use social media not to project a positive image of your own society, but to undermine the basic belief of other people in their own leaders and institutions. And he's been quite successful at that. So I think the overall impact of technology has been mixed. Again, we have to figure out ways of countering this kind of misuse of social media, but it's a problem.
I read recently that you no longer know yourself better than others. Google knows you better. So that has huge implications to the way we view ourselves, that we interact with power, or power interacts with citizens for that matter.
I was just talking to a friend of mine at Google about the election in the United States, and she showed me a map that Google had made of all of the IP addresses where information was coming from, a lot of them in Russia, going to websites in the United States and then out into social media. And you're right, Google knows this and I don't.
Haji Google, I call him. We will be moving from this conversation to a debate on governance. But before we do that, I would like to ask the audience a few questions about from the audience, and I will call on Ambassador Faley.
Lukman Faley, Iraqi ambassador to Washington. We met before, Professor. Welcome to Iraq and Kurdistan. We had the debate 2 years ago at Stanford. We talked about ISIS as a problem then, a regional problem, global problem. Now I would think that post-ISIS we have the concept which Dr. Barham talked about, which was populism. And your discussion with Dr. Barham was more about the diagnosis of the problem. Let me push you on the prognosis of the problem. Would you see populism as a factor which will help us to converge or diverge globally, more so than when you talked in this region and you said we are just post-19th century? We know where the 20th century started with, the First World War. Are we in a convergence or a divergence in relation to populism? Thank you.
Well, there's convergence in the sense that there are trends in global politics. So we're clearly in a trend in which populism is on the rise, and many countries are experiencing this. But how long this lasts is not clear, because in many respects, the people that support populist politicians are older, less educated, more rural, so that in many societies, these are people who demographically are not the leading edge of their societies. And I think over time, that group will shrink. I believe that those of us that want to hold on to a liberal society at home and a liberal international order have to actually deal with the discontents that lead to the populism having to do with immigration, income inequality, deindustrialization, loss of incomes for working people. A lot of these I don't think we'll be able to solve very easily because, for example, the loss of jobs is more related to technology than to globalization. But we still have to do something because in a democracy, you have a large part of, or not a large, but you have a significant part of the population that is very unhappy and resentful, and I don't think you can simply shout them down. You have to actually do something in terms of shifting policy. So I think that's going to happen in both the United States and in Europe. I think that the message has come through loud and clear that globalization without adequate safeguards and supports for the losers of globalization is not going to work.
Deputy Prime Minister Talabani.
Good morning, Professor. My name is Qubat Talabani. I'm the Deputy Prime Minister of Kurdistan. On behalf of the government of Kurdistan, I'd like to welcome you, to Kurdistan. In many areas, obviously, America is very advanced, but I think populism took root here much earlier and much faster than it has in the United States. At the same time, we are trying to undertake painful and tough reforms. How do you advise us? How do we balance these tough and painful reforms in a growing populist society? Is it doable? Thank you.
Well, populism exists in all societies. It comes and goes because it's very easy, especially in democracies, for politicians to promise things that are appealing in the short run but are very bad in the long run. That's why, all of Europe faces a huge crisis with pensions, because it's easy to promise things that you'll pay 20, 30 years down the road without having a way to pay for them. How do you fix that? I think that, unfortunately, the way that politics works often is that you can't fix the demand that drives populism until there's a big shock to the system, until there's a crisis. It could take the form of a war, it could take the form of a financial crisis, government shutting down, various sorts of things for people to realize, oh wait, we really have to change the way things are happening. I felt that the financial crisis in the United States in 2008 could have been that kind of a crisis for us, and unfortunately it wasn't a big enough one. So I'm not hoping for a crisis, but I think that, realistically, a lot of times you can't puncture this populist bubble until something big happens that makes it clear that you cannot persist in a populist policy.
Thank you. Ambassador Stark.
Thank you very much. And I really congratulate you on this brilliant presentation. We respect highly your intellectual, background. I did not have the intention to take the floor, but since Turkey is mentioned a few times by yourself, and especially our government, I have no choice but to say just a few things about it. So I fully agree with you that the feeling of insecurity in people lead to different consequences. Feeling of belonging, identity, they are all important. So when people feel weak, they look for strong leaders, strong governments. And then this is why in our region, weak governments are doomed to fail. We have seen it in Afghanistan, we have seen it here in this region and elsewhere. Especially when there are very strong governments around you, strong armies, and all nations of the world are spending more and more in defense because they are, I think, preparing for a greater war, which is in the making maybe. And even we are at war in a different way because now this is hybrid warfare. As I mentioned yesterday, there are different tactics. Armies are not fighting each other face to face, but they use terrorism and other tools. So in this context, nations feel that they need strong leaders. In the case of Turkey, for example, I can tell you, maybe highly liberal intellectuals may dislike our president and his government, but I can tell you, the overwhelming majority of Turkey will be united in supporting the president if there is a coup attempt, for example, to overthrow him. by a foreign network. This is so important, and I don't think that the West have to recognize that it is in shrinking mode, it's aging, it's losing economic share of the world production and everything. But the answer is not to topple governments, to let people also to express themselves. Also in this country, after ISIS, Daesh, there will be another strong movement. If these people continue to feel insecure, continue to feel expelled, you need democracy, yes, but before democracy, you need demos. It's not possible to have perfect democracy by changing demographics in the region, and so I'm sorry, but
thank you.
I had to make this intervention. Thank you.
Thank you.
No, I appreciate that. I mean, nobody, I think that you've caught the basic dynamic correctly, that many democratic states are perceived as weak and people want strong leadership. I think the problem, though, is what you mean by strong and what the limits to that strength are. Of course, there should not be a coup attempt against the government, and of course, there needs to be the capacity to fight terrorism in its many different forms. Is it necessary to arrest that many journalists? Is it necessary to arrest, academics who really haven't expressed any serious, anti-regime sentiments? This sort of thing. I think these are the things that Turkey's friends abroad in America, these are the things that we worry about.
Hanar, she's an alumni of the university.
First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Barham for inviting Professor Fukuyama, because I think it's a dream of so many of us. So welcome here. We have read your books, and it's in the curriculum of the university. We really appreciate your knowledge, your strategic way of thinking, how we are learning a lot from you. But I have a question on, you talked about religion, and both of you focused on religion in this part of the world. But unfortunately, if we talk about the KRG, and if we talk about Kurdistan, the four parts, it's more about, especially here, it's more about the rule of tribes. Unfortunately, that is the truth, especially in this part. How can we fade this type of ruling? Because year after year, we see that the sense of nationalism, the sense of identity, it's being faded in this part. And unfortunately, we see forces of the parts of Kurdistan are fighting against each other. In a way, we are calling for referendum, calling for independence. And in the other part, we are for fighting each other. So what is your advice on this kind of ruling in this part of the world? Thank you very much again.
So, as we say in American English, I'm going to punt on that question, because quite honestly, I don't know enough about Kurdish politics, internal Kurdish politics, to really give you a sensible answer. And I think given the different sensitivities just in this room, it's probably a topic I should stay away from. So.
Well, you have been briefed well. But Hanar's question is very relevant, and this is the issue of identities. What is the identity? Is it the tribe? Is it the political party? Is it the country? Is it values? This is the kind of problems many societies go through. But I would say on that, if I may, there is no end to history. Life goes on, people have to try and make it better. You told me, Professor, yesterday, it's never the end of history. It's that stopped before the end of history. So we are at that moment of time. We will conclude with Mr. Amr Musa. I call him the youngest statesman of the region. Younger statesman, huh?
Thank you very much. First of all, let me express my extreme pleasure to listen to the professor, to Dr. Fukuyama, whose book about end of history I read. immediately after the 1991 events. My question is, at that time, two theories, two books, after the end of the Cold War, with the victory of the West, the liberal policies, the free world, etc., over communism, came two theories. One, end of history. The second is clash of civilization. End of history, to my mind, was end of the war among systems with the victory of your system, the American system. As for the other one is the confrontation with Islam in particular. And I'm raising that not as an accusation, but as a point of clarification. Is there a link between what you have said about clash of civilization, about end of history, and what Professor Huntington raised about clash of civilizations with a special reference to Islam? Then that's the end of history insofar as systems are concerned, but we still have a problem with a certain civilization. Will you elaborate on that point, please? Thank you.
Well, so my critique of Huntington's position is the same as it was when that book first came out, that most people don't think of themselves in civilizational terms. There is a Muslim ummah, which has a certain meaning for Muslims, but people think of themselves as Kurds or Arabs or Iraqis or Syrians, whatever. And most of those political identities are much more important than the civilizational identity. Furthermore, there are big political divisions within these supposed civilizational units between people that want rule of law, a more limited kind of governments that are powerful yet limited by the rule of law, and between people that have a very different conception of power. And so right from the beginning, it seemed to me that, yes, of course, there is a certain degree of cultural difference that influences the politics of different regions. But it is more important to pay attention to the differences that exist within these different cultural units, because that's actually the way that in real life politics is organized. And I still think that is the way that we ought to look, both not just at the Middle East, but really any particular region of the world.
Ali's an MP. This is the final question, because we need to move to the next panel. It's about governance.
You're welcome for Kurdistan. I am member of Parliament Kurdistan. I need question about Kurdistan.
I warned you though.
لعراق لكردستان دا. You can.
Oh, okay.
لعراق لكردستان دا پوپولیزم وەک ناسنامەیەکی خراپ بەکارەهێنرێ بۆ دوورخستنەوەی ئەو ناجۆریە کە هەیە لە کوردستاندا. بۆ نمونە ئێستا لە کوردستانە من ئەندامی پەرلەمانم، بەڵام ساڵێک و 6 مانگە ناتوانم بچمە پەرلەمان و ئیشی پەرلەمان تاریکەم لەبەرەوەی ویستم یاسا جێبەجێکەم پەرلەمانەکە داخرا. ئەم هاوڕێمە لە سلێمانی لە 160 دەنگیێنا، بەڵام نەیتوانی بێ بە پارێزگار. لە کوردستاندا حکومەتێکی دیکتاتۆری خزمەتگوزاریش نییە. ئەوەی کە تۆ باست کرد حکومەت کاری ئەوەیە 24 کاتژمێر کارەبا دابینکە. فەرمانبەر نی و موچە وەردەگرێت. خانەنشین 2 مانگ جارێک موچە وەردەگرێت. حکومەت بۆتە ژێر قەرزێکی زۆرەوە ناتوانێت بیداتەوە. خەدەمات لەو پەڕی خراپیە، پەرلەمان داخراوە. خەڵک گەشتووە بە ئاستێک کە بێئومێد بێ لە هەڵبژاردنیش. واتە هەڵبژاردنە بیتەوە ئەو پەڕیەگەی بە پەرلەمان، دوجار پەرلەمان داخرێت. و حزبی سیاسی بە تەواتی سەیطرەی کردووە. دەوڵەمەندترینەکانی ئەم وڵاتە ئەوەی کە خۆ باسی لە جۆرێ لە حکومڕانی کرد سیاسیەکانن. لەم وڵاتە هەژار نایەتە ئاستی مام ناون، بەڵکو ئەوەی کە کەمێ دەوڵەمەندشە هەژارەکرێ. پرسیاری من ئەوەیە کاتێ باس لەمەیەکەی پێتەڵێن پۆپۆلیزمی تۆ بۆ بۆ دوورخستنەوەی ناسنامەی خۆیان بۆ ئەوەی بەمە کۆتایی بە حیوارەکە بێنێ بۆی بڵێ ئەمە ڕاست نییە ئەمە جۆرێکە لە شعبەویەت جۆرێکە لە پۆپۆلیزم پرسیاری من ئەوەیە ئێمە سوود لە ئەفکاری تۆ وەرگرین کاتێک کە خەڵک بێ ئومێ دەبێت لە انتخابات بێ ئومێ دەبێت لە سندوقی دەنگدان تەجروبەی دەوروبەری شەبینین شۆڕش نەتیجەیەکی ئەو تۆی نییە چی بکەین
سپاس. Did you get the gist of the question? Populism is a way, as an accusation that people are prevented from pushing for the reforms. In a way that ties to what Qubad was also talking about, the imperative of reform versus what people demand in terms of...
Sure. Well, like I said, unfortunately, I'm not familiar enough with Kurdish politics to really give you a very specific answer. I think it's true that people can be diverted from expressing their own real self-interest by slogans or ideologies. In the United States, a lot of working class people vote for policies that don't benefit them because, for ideological reasons. So I can well imagine that happens here. It is the job, I think, of politicians to mobilize people around issues that matter. And so if there are bad services or, the kinds of deficits that you're talking about, the political system needs to adjust, and make those the target of political pressure. So.
I will have to conclude because it's the end of the time and we have way over time and we have quite a busy agenda. I want to thank you, but I want to leave this conversation with the following thought. There is no end to history. History will go on. There is the future of history in so many ways. And our society, like so many others, is challenged. We have serious issues. And the issues that we have been talking about yesterday and will be talking about today are a sign or a statement about the challenges we have to do. But at least, Professor, we have the option of making it happen, working for it, trying to make it happen, not to give up. Yes, we do have problems, but the success of Kurdistan as a model of tolerance needs to be retained. We have serious economic and governance problems in the society, but we need to do better. And you being with us and so many distinguished guests being with us, the help of the international community to make in Kurdistan reform, move beyond the challenges of the day will be important. Help us to reform and sustain the success model. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you.